last year, my team looked into data from several water management programs, hundreds of them, to determine to what extent were they being fully implemented. So we started with the premise that, with the assumption that for a water management program to be effective, successful in reducing the risk of Legionella and other waterborne pathogens, it needs to be comprehensive. First of all, it needs to address all the water systems that should be addressed, and devices, and it needs to have all of the control measures and really good specific control measures that should have for those devices and systems. And the other thing is it needs to be implemented, which might seem obvious, but those of you involved in water management programs, you know very well there are a lot of facilities who have a really great document, but it sits on a shelf and it doesn't get implemented. So you don't reduce risk. You don't reduce risk only by what you actually do, not by what you write down. So we looked at a couple, 3 or 4 metrics to determine implementation. We knew that the facilities that had these water management plans we were studying, that they had comprehensive plans because of the software that they used to develop these plans. They can deactivate control measures in the software, but we were going with the assumption that at least they had access to the comprehensive content. So we wanted to find out to what extent were they fully implementing those plans, and we looked at control measure verification compliance. So if you're familiar with ASHRAE 188, you know that periodically it requires that you verify implementation of control measures and other procedures. You review documentation to make sure they're being carried out. And then we looked at not just numbers of tests, not the test results in this study, but the numbers of tests of Legionella, temperature, and disinfectants in particular. And it was interesting, we really weren't initially looking for what impact it had on Legionella results. We just wanted to find out to what extent were they fully implementing them. And we found out that a couple of things were really interesting. If you look at this far left column, this is the control measure compliance percentage, meaning the percentage of control measures that were okay. And only 20% of the plans we studied had control measure compliance 80% or greater, which isn't too good. And only 10% of the facilities were testing for Legionella. Well, let me take that back. 7% had tested at least one test for Legionella in the last 12 months, but only 10% had tested 20 or more samples. So that's probably, unless these were really small facilities and they weren't, that probably means they were testing once a year, 20 samples, right? Unless they were testing twice at 10 samples each, it's probably one time a year. So only 10% were doing that. So, but the ones who were doing it, like as control measure compliance increased, the numbers of tests increased as well, almost in every category. So not only Legionella, but other microbes, temperatures, and disinfectants, which clearly showed that the facilities that were engaged in their control measures, keeping up with their control measures, they did everything else too. They did more tests. And here's what's really interesting that we didn't expect, we really weren't looking for this, but we found that as engagement went up in all these categories, Legionella positivity went down. Positivity is the percentage of samples in which Legionella is found in the plumbing system. Really linearly, pretty much. It went down as engagement and implementation went up. And keep in mind, well, let me say first of all, this clearly shows that the premise of ASHRAE 188 is sound. That if a facility will fully implement a comprehensive water management plan, it's going to reduce the risk, at least based on these hundreds of plans we studied, it's going to reduce Legionella, it's going to reduce the risk of Legionellosis. But, and here's a big but, these were the cream of the crop, by the way. These are the really prestigious facilities. They do most things right, and even among them, the compliance, the degree of implementation was pretty low. And so if you take that in the larger universe of all the facilities that should have water management programs per ASHRAE 188, it's like a dot in terms of the facilities that are really doing a good job. So what does that tell us? And why does this reflect back to what I started to talk about automation? Well, some are going to say, well, this just means we need regulations, like we talked about on the panel yesterday. You need regulations because facilities are not going to establish water management programs unless they have to, and that's true. But you can't regulate to the extent that to force facilities to do it really well, to have comprehensive plans and to make sure they're fully implemented. You can't be that prescriptive and inspect often enough. It just doesn't work. So you have to somehow figure out a way to motivate facilities to want to do the plan well. And I think the real takeaway here is that the plans have to be easier. The benefits are clear in having a water management plan in terms of reducing legal risk, reducing health risk. And if more facilities were aware of that, they would do it anyway. But if you make it easier for them, they're going to be that much more likely to do it.